He stared at the bracelet in his mother's hand and asked a question that would change everything. Who gave this back to you? Luca Moretti rarely sounded uncertain, but this time there was something different in his voice. The elderly woman sitting across from him smiled softly as sunlight poured through the tall windows of her home. She ran her fingers along the silver bracelet and looked toward the garden outside. An angel, she said. Luca frowned slightly. His mother was not a woman easily impressed. She had spent decades surrounded by powerful people, expensive gifts, and endless displays of loyalty. Yet the warmth in her eyes suggested something far more meaningful than any of those things. Before Luca could ask another question, she gently closed her hand around the bracelet. 4 days ago, she said. The memory returned to her immediately. 4 days earlier, cold rain had fallen over downtown Chicago. The sidewalks shimmered beneath gray skies as people hurried between office buildings, coffee shops, and train stations. Most kept their heads down, focused on schedules and responsibilities. Nobody seemed interested in anyone else. Eleanor Moretti preferred days like that. At 73 years old, she still enjoyed walking through the city alone. Despite her son's influence and wealth, she disliked bodyguards and attention. She wanted to feel like an ordinary person whenever possible. That afternoon, she carried a small shopping bag and wore a simple coat that revealed nothing about her family status. To everyone around her, she appeared to be just another elderly woman navigating a rainy day. Across the city, Danielle Brooks had just finished a long cleaning shift at a hotel. Her feet ached. Her back hurt. The paycheck she expected at the end of the week was already committed to bills before it even arrived. Her father needed heart medication. Rent was due soon. The refrigerator at home contained less food than she wanted to admit. Yet despite the worries filling her mind, Danielle still found herself noticing people others ignored. She noticed the tired cashier working a double shift. She noticed the exhausted bus driver greeting passengers with a smile. She noticed the elderly man struggling to carry groceries across a busy intersection. Compassion had become a habit she never questioned. As Danielle walked toward the train station, the rain grew heavier. Umbrellas crowded the sidewalks. Car horns echoed through the streets. Then she noticed something unusual ahead. An elderly woman stood near the curb looking disoriented. For a brief moment, nobody paid attention. People moved around her as though she were invisible. Danielle slowed her pace. Something felt wrong. She watched as the woman attempted another step. Then it happened. The elderly woman lost her balance. Shopping bags slipped from her hands. Several pedestrians glanced over before continuing on their way. Some hesitated. None stopped. Danielle did. Without thinking twice, she dropped her own bag and rushed forward through the rain. Her shoes splashed through puddles as she reached the woman. Concern filled her face. "Ma'am, are you okay?" she asked gently. The woman looked up, surprised. Around them, the city continued moving. Strangers passed by. Traffic lights changed. Rain tapped against the pavement. But for the first time that afternoon, someone had chosen to stop. And neither of them realized that this simple moment was about to connect two completely different worlds. Danielle knelt beside the elderly woman as rain continued falling around them. Water rolled down umbrellas and splashed across the crowded sidewalk. Yet the world seemed strangely quiet within the small space they now shared. The woman looked shaken but alert. Her silver hair clung slightly to her coat, and one trembling hand rested against the pavement. Danielle offered a reassuring smile. "Take your time. There is no rush." The woman nodded gratefully. Together, they moved carefully toward a nearby bench beneath the shelter of a bus stop. Pedestrians continued hurrying past without a second glance. Some looked briefly in their direction before returning to their phones and schedules. Danielle could not understand how people could ignore someone clearly needing help. Once seated, the woman took a slow breath. "Thank you," she said softly. Most people did not even stop. Danielle handed her a clean napkin from her bag. Everyone has difficult days. Sometimes they are just too distracted to notice. The woman studied her face with curiosity. There was no judgment in Danielle's voice. No bitterness. Just kindness. After a few minutes, Danielle noticed the woman still seemed pale. Across the street sat a small coffee shop glowing with warm light. Without hesitation, Danielle crossed through the rain and returned carrying a cup of hot tea and a bowl of soup. The aroma drifted into the cool air. The elderly woman's eyes widened. "You did not have to do that." Danielle laughed softly. I know, but it seemed like a good idea. The woman accepted the tea with both hands. The warmth seemed to bring immediate comfort. As they sat together, conversation began naturally. The woman introduced herself simply as Eleanor. She never mentioned her last name. Danielle introduced herself and explained that she worked cleaning hotel rooms downtown. Eleanor listened carefully. She noticed how tired Danielle looked. Dark circles beneath her eyes hinted at long hours and sleepless nights. Yet despite obvious exhaustion, Danielle remained cheerful. Their conversation drifted from weather to family to favorite places in Chicago. For nearly 30 minutes, neither felt like a stranger anymore. Then Eleanor suddenly looked down at her wrist. Her expression changed. Oh dear. Danielle immediately noticed the concern. What is wrong? Eleanor turned her hand over several times. My bracelet. Danielle looked carefully. A faint pale mark remained where jewelry had once rested. The bracelet was gone. Eleanor's face fell. I was wearing it earlier. Danielle glanced toward the rain-soaked sidewalk where the accident had happened. Was it valuable? Eleanor hesitated. Not because of money. Her voice softened. It belonged to my husband. Danielle understood immediately. Some objects carried memories far more important than their price. Without another word, she stood. Then we should look for it. Eleanor looked surprised. In this weather? Danielle smiled. Some things are worth searching for. Together they retraced their path through the rain. Cars passed. Streetlights flickered on as evening approached. The city continued moving around them. For nearly 20 minutes they searched every puddle, every crack in the sidewalk, and every corner near the curb. But the bracelet remained missing. Eventually Eleanor sighed. Perhaps it is gone. Danielle was silent for a moment. Then she looked back toward the crowded street where hundreds of people had passed since the bracelet disappeared. A determined expression appeared on her face. Maybe, she said. Or maybe it is waiting for someone who refuses to give up. The rain finally eased as evening settled over Chicago, but Danielle refused to stop searching. Eleanor offered several times to let it go, insisting that the bracelet was probably lost forever. Yet every time she said those words, Danielle noticed a sadness behind her smile. It was the kind of sadness people carried when they lost something connected to a person they loved. Danielle understood that feeling. Her own mother had passed away years earlier, and there were still certain photographs she protected more carefully than any valuable possession. Memories had their own weight. Eventually, they reached a small covered plaza beside a bookstore where they could escape the damp weather. Eleanor sat on a bench while Danielle continued scanning the ground nearby. Streetlights reflected across wet pavement, creating pools of gold and silver light. The city seemed calmer now. For a few moments, neither woman spoke. Then Eleanor looked up. You have already done more than enough. Danielle smiled as she checked beneath another bench. That is what my father always says right before asking me for another favor. The comment made Eleanor laugh. It was a warm laugh, genuine and comforting. And what does your father do? She asked. Danielle finally returned to the bench and sat beside her. Mostly he worries me. Eleanor smiled. That sounds like many parents. Danielle nodded. He has a heart condition. Some days are better than others. For the first time that evening, she allowed a little of her own exhaustion to show. Long work hours, medical bills, and constant responsibility had become normal parts of her life. Yet she spoke about them without complaint. Eleanor listened carefully. She had spent enough years around people to recognize character. Danielle never tried to impress anyone. She never exaggerated her struggles. She simply carried them. The conversation drifted naturally from one subject to another. Eleanor shared stories about her late husband. She described his sense of humor, his love of old jazz records, and the way he always insisted on carrying groceries, even when he grew older. Danielle listened attentively. The more Eleanor spoke about him, the more she understood why the missing bracelet mattered. It was not jewelry. It was history. It was love. As darkness settled over the city, Danielle checked the time and realized she needed to head home. Her father would be waiting. Before leaving, she walked with Eleanor to a nearby taxi stand. The driver opened the door, and Eleanor carefully stepped inside. Then something unexpected happened. She reached into her purse and removed a small card. If you happen to find the bracelet, she said, please call me. Danielle accepted the card politely. It contained only a first name and a phone number. Nothing else. No company title. No family name. No indication of who Eleanor really was. Before Danielle could respond, the taxi began pulling away. Eleanor lowered the window and smiled. Thank you for treating me like a person. Danielle looked surprised. What else would I treat you like? Eleanor's smile widened. Then the taxi disappeared into traffic. Danielle began walking toward the train station, unaware that something small reflected beneath a storm drain several yards away. Hidden among rainwater and scattered leaves, a silver bracelet waited quietly in the darkness, still carrying a story neither woman had finished telling. The next morning began before sunrise for Danielle. Her small apartment was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic outside. She prepared breakfast for her father before leaving for work, carefully arranging his medication beside a glass of water. The routine had become second nature. Some people her age spent weekends traveling or enjoying time with friends. Danielle spent hers making sure her father had everything he needed. As she stepped outside into the cool morning air, she found herself thinking about Eleanor. Something about the elderly woman stayed with her. Perhaps it was the loneliness she had glimpsed behind Eleanor's smile. Or perhaps it was the sadness in her eyes when she realized the bracelet was missing. Throughout her cleaning shift at the hotel, the memory continued returning. Room after room blurred together. Fresh towels, clean sheets, vacuumed carpets. Yet between tasks, Danielle kept remembering the bracelet. By late afternoon, her shift finally ended. Most employees hurried toward buses and train stations. Danielle headed in a different direction. Instead of going home, she returned to the area where she had met Eleanor. The weather had improved dramatically. Sunlight reflected from office windows, and the sidewalks were crowded with people enjoying the break from rain. Danielle began searching again. She checked beneath benches, around street signs, and along every section of sidewalk where they had walked the previous evening. Nearly an hour passed. Then, just as she began questioning whether the search was hopeless, something caught her eye. A faint silver reflection glimmered beneath the metal grate of a storm drain. Her heart skipped. Danielle immediately crouched down. There it was. The bracelet. Mud and rainwater partially covered it, but the silver surface remained unmistakable. Relief spread across her face. She looked around for help and soon found a maintenance worker nearby. Together, they carefully retrieved the bracelet without damaging it. When Danielle finally held it in her hands, she understood immediately why Eleanor treasured it. The craftsmanship was beautiful, but more importantly, years of careful use had polished parts of the silver smooth. This was not something hidden away in a jewelry box. It had been worn, loved, and carried through countless memories. Danielle smiled. She should have gone home. She should have rested. She should have saved bus fare and time. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out the card Eleanor had given her. A few minutes later, she made the call. The elderly woman answered on the second ring. Hello. Danielle smiled. I think I found something that belongs to you. Silence followed. Then a sharp intake of breath. You found it. I did. Eleanor sounded almost overwhelmed. They arranged to meet the following afternoon. After the call ended, Danielle slipped the bracelet safely into her purse and finally headed home. Across the city, Eleanor sat quietly in her living room staring at the phone. Tears gathered in her eyes. Not because of the bracelet itself, because someone had cared enough to keep searching after everyone else would have stopped. For several moments, she simply sat there holding the card Danielle had accepted the day before. Then she smiled. Later that evening, when her son Luca arrived for dinner, he immediately noticed the change in her mood. You seem happy, he said. Eleanor looked toward the bracelet-shaped mark still visible on her wrist. A warm smile touched her face. I met someone extraordinary, she replied. And for the first time, Luca became curious about the stranger who had unknowingly stepped into their lives. The following afternoon arrived bright and clear, as though the city itself wanted to make up for the storm that had brought Danielle and Eleanor together. Danielle finished work early and carefully wrapped the recovered bracelet inside a clean handkerchief before placing it in her purse. She could have mailed it. She could have asked someone else to deliver it. Instead, she chose to return it personally. Some things deserved that level of care. Their meeting place was a small cafe overlooking a quiet city park. Children played near a fountain while office workers enjoyed late lunches beneath the warm spring sun. Danielle arrived a few minutes early. When Eleanor appeared, her face immediately brightened. The elderly woman moved a little more carefully than before, but her smile carried genuine warmth. You found it, she said before even sitting down. Danielle reached into her purse and gently placed the bracelet on the table. Sunlight reflected across the silver surface. For a moment, Eleanor simply stared at it. Then she carefully picked it up with both hands. Emotion filled her eyes. I thought I would never see this again. Danielle smiled. I almost did not find it either. Eleanor fastened the bracelet around her wrist and looked at it for several seconds. The gesture seemed almost ceremonial, like welcoming an old friend home. After a moment, she looked up. Thank you. Danielle shrugged gently. Anyone would have done the same. Eleanor laughed softly. No, they would not. The certainty in her voice surprised Danielle. They ordered coffee and spent the next hour talking. Eleanor learned more about Danielle's life. She learned about the hotel where she worked. She learned about her father and the medical appointments that seemed to multiply every month. She learned about the dreams Danielle had quietly set aside while caring for someone else. Yet despite hearing about the challenges, Eleanor noticed something remarkable. Danielle never sounded bitter. She never blamed anyone. She simply kept moving forward. Eventually, Eleanor reached into her purse and removed an envelope. Please, she said, allow me to thank you properly. Danielle immediately understood what it was. She gently pushed the envelope back across the table. I cannot accept that. Eleanor looked surprised. You spent hours searching. Because it mattered to you. And because of that, it matters to me. Danielle smiled kindly. Then seeing it back on your wrist is enough. For several seconds, neither woman spoke. Eleanor had spent much of her life around people who expected something in return. Favors usually arrived with conditions attached. Kindness often came with hidden motives. Danielle seemed entirely different. Before leaving, Eleanor asked one final question. If you ever need help, would you call me? Danielle hesitated before smiling politely. I appreciate that. It was not an answer. Eleanor knew it. Danielle knew it. Yet neither mentioned it. After they parted ways, Eleanor returned home carrying more than a recovered bracelet. She carried a story she could not stop thinking about. That evening, Luca Moretti arrived for dinner as usual. The moment he entered, he noticed the bracelet. Then he noticed the unusual happiness in his mother's expression. During dinner, she told him everything. The fall, the rain, the tea, the search, the returned bracelet. Luca listened quietly. By the end of the story, he found himself unexpectedly intrigued. What was her name, he asked. Eleanor smiled. Danielle Brooks. Luca leaned back in his chair. The name meant nothing to him. Yet for reasons he could not explain, he suddenly wanted to know more about the woman who had helped his mother without ever knowing who she really was. For most people, Danielle Brooks would have been easy to overlook. She cleaned hotel rooms, rode crowded trains, and lived in a modest apartment on the south side of the city. Her life rarely crossed paths with powerful people. Yet over the next several days, her name appeared more than once in conversations taking place far above the world she knew. Luca Moretti found himself thinking about her far more often than he expected. At first, it was simple curiosity. His mother had spoken about Danielle with unusual admiration. That alone was enough to attract his attention. Eleanor had always been an excellent judge of character. If she called someone extraordinary, there was usually a reason. One afternoon, while reviewing business matters in his downtown office, Luca found himself staring out the window instead of reading the reports in front of him. The Chicago skyline stretched beneath a clear blue sky, but his thoughts remained elsewhere. Finally, he asked a trusted assistant to learn more about Danielle. Nothing invasive, nothing improper. He simply wanted to understand why a stranger had made such a strong impression on his mother. The information that returned surprised him. Danielle worked 6 days a week at a hotel. She had no criminal record, no financial scandals, no history of seeking attention or favors. The details seemed ordinary at first. Then more information emerged. She spent most of her income caring for her father, whose heart condition required ongoing treatment. She regularly volunteered at a neighborhood food pantry whenever her schedule allowed. Several coworkers described her as the first person to help when someone faced a problem. One manager even recalled Danielle quietly collecting donations for an employee whose apartment had been damaged by a fire. Luca sat silently as he reviewed the notes. There was no publicity attached to any of it. No social media posts. No attempts to gain recognition. She simply helped people. The realization felt strangely refreshing. In his world, generosity often arrived with cameras, announcements, or expectations. Danielle's kindness seemed invisible by design. Meanwhile, Danielle remained completely unaware of the attention surrounding her. Life continued exactly as before. She woke before sunrise. She prepared meals for her father. She worked long hours at the hotel. She balanced bills and responsibilities while trying not to worry about the future. The encounter with Eleanor had become a pleasant memory, nothing more. She certainly never imagined that one of the most influential men in the city was quietly learning about her life. Several days later, Luca visited his mother for dinner again. Eleanor sat comfortably in her favorite chair near the window, the recovered bracelet shining softly beneath the evening light. "You have been thinking about her," Eleanor said without looking up from her book. Luca smiled. "Is it that obvious?" Eleanor closed the book and studied him. "What did you learn?" He considered the question carefully. "That you were right." A warm smile crossed her face. Luca rarely admitted something so directly. He walked toward the window and looked out across the garden. Most people would have accepted money for returning the bracelet. Eleanor nodded. She refused. Most people would have stopped searching after 10 minutes. Eleanor nodded again. She did not. Silence settled between them. Then Eleanor spoke softly. "The world needs more people like her." Luca looked toward the bracelet on her wrist. For a moment, he imagined Danielle standing alone in the rain, helping a stranger everyone else ignored. The image stayed with him, and for reasons he could not fully explain, he decided it was finally time to meet her himself. The opportunity arrived on a Thursday afternoon when Danielle least expected it. The hotel lobby buzzed with its usual rhythm. Guests rolled suitcases across polished floors. Business travelers hurried toward elevators. Staff members moved efficiently between assignments. Danielle was finishing a shift in one of the upper floors when her supervisor suddenly appeared. "Danielle, can you help downstairs?" he asked. "We are hosting a private meeting and need extra support in the executive lounge." Danielle nodded immediately. Extra work never frightened her. A few minutes later, she entered one of the most exclusive sections of the hotel. The executive lounge occupied the top floor and overlooked the Chicago skyline through enormous windows. Leather chairs, polished wood, and quiet luxury filled the room. Normally, she worked far from spaces like this. Her job was simple: refill refreshments, organize supplies, make sure everything remained spotless. Nothing more. As Danielle arranged coffee service near a conference area, several black vehicles pulled up outside the building below. She barely noticed. Important guests arrived at the hotel every day. Across the room, executives and business leaders began taking their seats. Conversations grew quieter. Security personnel positioned themselves discreetly near entrances. The atmosphere shifted. Something significant was happening. Danielle continued working, unaware that one of the arriving guests was Luca Moretti. He entered the lounge surrounded by several associates. Tall, composed, and dressed in a tailored dark suit, he carried the calm authority of someone accustomed to leadership. Most people noticed him immediately. Danielle did not. She remained focused on her tasks. Luca greeted several individuals before his attention unexpectedly drifted across the room. Near a refreshment station stood a woman arranging coffee cups with careful precision. Dark skin, kind eyes, professional uniform. Something about her seemed familiar. He looked again. Then realization arrived. Danielle Brooks. The woman his mother had spoken about. The woman who had returned the bracelet. The woman who had searched through rain for a stranger. For several moments, Luca simply watched from a distance. Not out of suspicion. Out of curiosity. Everything his mother described appeared genuine. Danielle moved naturally from one task to another, greeting coworkers politely and helping a new employee who seemed overwhelmed. Nobody treated her like someone extraordinary, yet she quietly made life easier for everyone around her. The meeting continued for nearly an hour. During that time, Danielle remained completely unaware that one of the most powerful men in the room already knew her name. Eventually, the event concluded. Guests began leaving. Staff started cleaning. Danielle gathered empty cups and trays while preparing the lounge for the next reservation. Then she heard a voice behind her. "Miss Brooks." She turned. The man standing before her looked familiar, though she could not immediately place him. His presence commanded attention without effort. Several nearby employees suddenly became very quiet. Danielle noticed the change immediately. "Yes," she replied. Luca offered a polite smile. "I wanted to thank you." Danielle blinked in confusion. "For what?" His smile widened slightly. "For helping my mother." The tray nearly slipped from her hands. For a moment, she simply stared at him. Then memories rushed together. Eleanor. The bracelet. The stories. The kindness. Slowly, realization appeared on her face. Around them, the room seemed to fall silent. Danielle looked from Luca to the employees watching nearby and back again. The truth she never expected was finally standing directly in front of her. And in that moment, she realized the elderly woman she had treated like an ordinary stranger was connected to a world far larger than she had ever imagined. For several seconds, Danielle could not find the right words. The executive lounge seemed smaller somehow, as if the walls themselves had moved closer. Around her, coworkers pretended to continue working, but she could feel their curiosity. Everyone knew who Luca Moretti was. His name carried influence throughout the city. Yet he stood before her with none of the arrogance she expected from someone in his position. "Your mother is Eleanor?" Danielle finally asked. Luca nodded. A faint smile appeared on his face. "She talks about you. Often." Danielle looked genuinely surprised. "I only helped her for a few hours." "That is exactly why she talks about you." The answer caught her off guard. Luca glanced toward the windows overlooking the skyline. Most people saw an elderly woman in the rain and kept walking. He looked back at her. "You did not." Danielle lowered her eyes briefly. She had never considered her actions unusual. To her, helping someone in need was not extraordinary. It was simply the right thing to do. "Anyone should have helped her," she said quietly. Luca remembered hearing almost the exact same words from his mother. The similarity made him smile. "Perhaps," he replied, "but you were the one who actually did." The conversation continued longer than either expected. Employees gradually left the lounge until only a few remained. Danielle learned that Eleanor had spoken about her repeatedly since their meeting. Luca admitted that he had been curious enough to learn more about the woman who returned a treasured family keepsake without accepting anything in return. Danielle felt slightly embarrassed by the attention. She was accustomed to being overlooked, not discussed. Eventually, Luca asked a question. "Why did you refuse the envelope my mother offered?" Danielle knew exactly what he meant. "Because she did not owe me anything. You spent hours searching. She would have done the same for me." Luca studied her carefully. The conviction in her voice was genuine. She truly believed what she was saying. In a world where so many people calculated value through profit and advantage, that kind of sincerity felt increasingly rare. A few days later, another surprise arrived. Danielle finished work and returned home to find Eleanor sitting in the living room beside her father. The two were laughing together as if they had known each other for years. Danielle stopped in the doorway, completely stunned. Eleanor rose with a delighted smile. "I hope you do not mind the visit." Her father grinned. "Your friend brought pie." The evening that followed felt strangely natural. They shared dinner, exchanged stories, and talked for hours. Eleanor learned more about Danielle's family. Danielle learned more about Eleanor's life. Yet even then, Eleanor never spoke about wealth or influence. She spoke about people, memories, family, loss, gratitude. Before leaving, Eleanor quietly handed Danielle's father information about a respected cardiac specialist she trusted. It was not presented as charity. It was simply one person helping another. As weeks passed, an unexpected friendship continued to grow. Luca occasionally joined them. What began as curiosity slowly became respect. The more he observed Danielle, the more he understood why his mother admired her. She treated everyone with the same kindness regardless of status. Hotel guests, co-workers, strangers, elderly women in the rain. There was no performance in it. No expectation of reward. One evening, after another family dinner, Luca stood beside the apartment window watching city lights flicker across the skyline. Eleanor smiled knowingly from across the room. She had spent years reading people. She recognized the expression on her son's face immediately. It was not fascination with power or beauty. It was admiration for character. And she knew that before this story ended, Danielle's simple act of kindness would change far more lives than she ever imagined. Spring arrived quietly that year. The city seemed brighter somehow, as though the long winter had finally released its grip. For Danielle Brooks, life remained busy, but the constant weight she had carried for so many years felt a little lighter. Her father began receiving treatment from the specialist Eleanor had recommended. His health improved gradually, one appointment at a time. The change was not dramatic. It was real. And for the first time in a long while, Danielle allowed herself to believe that better days might actually be possible. What surprised her most was that none of the support she received ever felt like charity. Eleanor refused to treat her as a project to be rescued. Luca refused to treat her as someone who owed him gratitude. Instead, they became part of her life the same way she had become part of theirs. Through respect, through trust, through simple human connection. One afternoon, several months after the rainy day that started everything, Danielle received an invitation to a small family gathering at Eleanor's home. She almost declined. Large homes and influential families still made her uncomfortable. But Eleanor insisted. When Danielle arrived, she found something unexpected. There were no formal events, no business discussions, no displays of wealth. There was simply a family lunch beneath the warm sunlight of a garden terrace. Flowers bloomed along stone pathways. Birds moved between trees. Laughter drifted through the air. Eleanor sat at the center of it all, wearing the silver bracelet that had unknowingly changed so many lives. During the meal, she suddenly raised her glass. The conversation stopped. Everyone looked toward her. Eleanor smiled warmly at Danielle. "There is something I would like everyone to remember." The garden grew quiet. "Months ago, I fell on a rainy sidewalk." Several guests exchanged curious looks. They had never heard the story. Eleanor continued. "Hundreds of people walked past me. One person stopped. Her eyes settled on Danielle. She did not know my name. She did not know my family. She did not know anything about me. She simply chose kindness." Silence filled the garden. Danielle felt her cheeks grow warm. She never enjoyed being the center of attention. Yet nobody looked at her with pity or obligation. They looked at her with respect. Luca watched quietly from across the table. He had spent his life meeting powerful people, ambitious people, and influential people. Yet few had impressed him the way Danielle had. Not because of what she possessed, because of who she was when nobody was watching. After lunch, guests wandered through the gardens while Eleanor and Danielle sat together near a fountain. Sunlight reflected across the bracelet resting on Eleanor's wrist. The older woman smiled. "You know," she said softly, "I almost lost this forever." Danielle laughed gently. "I remember." Eleanor shook her head. "No, I am not talking about the bracelet." For a moment, Danielle looked confused. Then she understood. The elderly woman reached over and squeezed her hand. No further explanation was needed. As the afternoon faded into evening, Luca walked Danielle toward the front gate. The gardens glowed beneath golden light. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Luca smiled. "My mother was right about you." Danielle laughed. "She says the same thing about you." They stood there for a second, sharing the kind of quiet understanding that cannot be purchased or forced. It can only be earned. As Danielle walked away, she thought back to the rainy afternoon when she stopped for a stranger everyone else ignored. At the time, it had felt like a small decision. A simple act of kindness. Nothing more. Yet that single moment had connected families, restored hope, created friendships, and changed lives. And that day, everyone who knew the story remembered what true kindness looks like when nobody is expecting anything in return.